There's a number that should terrify the Spanish monarchy, and it's not a number about Leonor. In May 2026, a study out of the University of Murcia found that 51.5% of Spaniards would choose a republic over the crown if given the choice, compared to 48.5% who'd keep the monarchy. Spain is now the most critical country of its own monarchy out of 7 European nations studied in that same academic project. That's the backdrop. That's the actual state of public opinion toward the Spanish crown as an institution in 2026. And yet, inside that same skeptical, divided, often outright hostile political climate, one member of the royal family keeps posting numbers that look like they belong to a completely different country. Leonor, consistently rated the most trusted figure in the Spanish royal family, outscoring her own father, outscoring her grandmother, and by a wide margin outscoring the man whose scandals nearly brought the whole institution down. So the real question isn't whether Spain trusts its monarchy. The polling is clear that it largely doesn't, not uncritically anyway. The real question is why one 20-year-old, in an era of record institutional distrust, keeps beating everyone else in her own family, and what that actually tells us about where this monarchy is heading. I want to be upfront about something before we go further, because precision matters more to me than a catchy title. Finally, trust implies something settled, something resolved, a switch that flipped. That's not quite what the data shows. What the data actually shows is more interesting than that. Trust in Leonor specifically has been climbing steadily since she came of age, even as trust in the monarchy as an institution has stayed stubbornly divided, and in some measures gotten worse. She's not proof that Spain has resolved its complicated relationship with the crown. She's proof that Spaniards are capable of separating their skepticism about an institution from their assessment of an individual, and that separation is exactly what the palace has been quietly building toward for years. Stick around, because by the end of this video you'll understand exactly what the polling says, why it says it, and what stands in the way of this becoming something more permanent. To understand why Leonor's numbers look the way they do, you have to start with the number that came before her, the one that's been dragging down every royal family member by association since 2014. King Juan Carlos I, the man who built the modern Spanish monarchy after Franco's death, spent his final years in power accumulating scandal after scandal, a lavish elephant hunting trip during Spain's worst recession in decades, and fraud investigations spanning both Spain and Switzerland that eventually pushed him into exile in Abu Dhabi in August 2020, where he still lives. According to recent polling out of Moncloa's own reporting on the University of Murcia study, Juan Carlos remains the single worst-rated member of the royal family across virtually every survey conducted in the past several years, with approval ratings that dip as low as 3.4 to 3.6 out of 10, numbers that would be a career-ending disaster for any elected politician, let alone a former head of state. That's the shadow every other Bourbon has had to operate under since 2014. Felipe VI inherited a monarchy attached to a man the public simply does not forgive. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because Felipe's response to that inheritance wasn't to hide from scrutiny. It was to lean into transparency as a survival strategy, and Leonor became the clearest expression of that strategy in human form. Felipe renounced his own inheritance from his father, introduced a formal code of conduct for royal family members, and has spent over a decade trying to draw as sharp a line as possible between his reign and his father's. According to reporting from Malay Mail around Leonor's 18th birthday, a former editor of the royalist newspaper ABC summarized it bluntly: Juan Carlos was a foundational king undone by, in his words, sex and money, while his son restored the monarchy's reputation, and his granddaughter would give that restoration continuity. That's not spin from the palace. That's an outside observer connecting 3 generations into a single narrative arc: decline, recovery, and now, continuity through Leonor. So let's actually look at the numbers, because they tell a remarkably consistent story once you line them up chronologically. Back in October 2023, right around Leonor's 18th birthday, when she formally swore allegiance to the Constitution in front of the Spanish Parliament, a Sociometrica poll for El Español already had her as the best valued member of the royal family, with a score of 8.2 out of 10, ahead of her father's 7.3. That same wave of coverage described what Spanish media started calling Leonormania, a surge in public curiosity and goodwill tied specifically to the fact that she'd spent years out of the spotlight while studying abroad, which meant the public was essentially meeting her for the first time as an adult, without the baggage that comes from years of tabloid overexposure. A Euronews report from that same period quoted a political communications professor pointing out that the royal family had, in his words, gotten their timing right, because her reserve during her school years meant there was no accumulated scandal or overexposure to work against her. Move forward to January 2024, and a Sigma Dose poll picked up by Euroweekly News had her leading the entire family in popularity with a score of 8.1, ahead of the retired Queen Sofia and her younger sister, both at 7.7, and comfortably ahead of both her parents. What's genuinely remarkable in that particular poll is the political breakdown. PSOE voters, a party base that's traditionally far less monarchist than the conservative Partido Popular, still rated her 7.8. Even Sumar voters, from a party that leans considerably further left and more explicitly Republican, gave her a 4.4, which sounds unremarkable until you realize that's dramatically higher than what that same demographic typically gives the monarchy as an institution. And on the other end of the spectrum, Vox voters, a party base that's been openly skeptical about a female monarch taking the throne, still rated her a 9.2, just slightly behind the Partido Popular's 9.5. Read that carefully, because it's the single most important data point in this entire video. Leonor is one of the only figures in Spanish public life right now who pulls strong approval from voters on the nationalist right and voters on the Republican left simultaneously. That's not a coincidence. That's the specific outcome the monarchy has been engineering since 2014, even if nobody at the palace would ever put it in those terms publicly. Fast forward to January 2024's separate Sociometrica barometer, and you see the same pattern holding. Leonor at 8.1, best valued member of the household, with the poll also finding that 60% of Spaniards believe she will actually become queen, compared to only about 23% who think the system of government will change before she inherits the throne. That's a meaningful marker of institutional confidence even among people who might personally prefer a republic. They may not want the monarchy to continue, but a majority expects it will, and expects Leonor specifically to be the one wearing the crown when it does. Let's take a short pause here, because I want you to sit with something before we get into the more recent numbers, the ones from just a few months ago, which complicate this story in a way most other channels covering Leonor either don't know about or deliberately leave out. If you're the kind of person who wants the actual polling data behind these royal headlines instead of vague claims about popularity with no sourcing, this channel exists specifically for you, and there's more of this kind of breakdown coming. Subscribe now, because what comes next is the part of the story that most coverage of why Spain trusts Leonor conveniently skips. Here's the complication. Because trust in Leonor specifically and trust in the monarchy as an institution are not the same variable, and 2026 has made that gap wider and more visible than at any point since she came of age. That University of Murcia research project I mentioned at the top, part of an academic initiative called The Crowns comparing monarchies across 7 European countries, found that Spain stood alone among all 7 as the only country where support for a republic actually edges out support for the monarchy, 51.5% to 48.5%. This wasn't a fringe outlet. This was an academic research project that won funding from Spain's own Ministry of Science, Innovation and Universities. And within that same research, the statement that scored highest agreement among respondents, at 7.06 out of 10, was the idea that some members of the king's family commit reprehensible acts. There's also majority support, according to that same study, for the idea that the royal family should simply be smaller. That's the real temperature of Spanish public opinion toward the monarchy as an institution in mid-2026. Skeptical, distrustful of the family as a collective, and closely split on whether the institution should exist at all going forward. And yet, inside that same research, Leonor still comes out as the best valued individual figure in the entire royal family, scoring above 6 on both her contribution to the monarchy's image and her respect for ethical principles, according to Publico's coverage of the findings. So what you're actually looking at isn't a country that trusts its monarchy because of Leonor. You're looking at a country where a slim majority increasingly questions whether the monarchy should exist at all, while simultaneously, and almost paradoxically, holding a fairly favorable individual opinion of the person who's next in line to run it. That's a genuinely unusual position for public opinion to be in, and it's worth taking seriously instead of flattening it into a simple headline about universal trust. There's another data point worth sitting with, because it complicates things even further, and it comes from a poll conducted by Sigma Dose specifically about Leonor, not the monarchy generally. According to that survey, published through OLA, only around 45% of Spaniards consider the work she's done as heir to the crown to be good or very good, while 37% said they didn't know or preferred not to answer. That's not the overwhelming consensus a title like "Why the Spanish People Finally Trust Leonor" might lead you to expect. It's closer to a plurality, buoyed by a large chunk of the population that simply hasn't formed a strong opinion yet, likely because, as that Euronews piece from her 18th birthday pointed out, she spent years deliberately out of the public eye. That same Sigma Dose survey did find something genuinely favorable for her long-term prospects though. About 47% of respondents believe she's helping bring the monarchy closer to younger Spaniards, a demographic where the institution has historically struggled the most. So if the picture is this mixed, why does the narrative around Leonor keep trending toward growing trust rather than growing skepticism? A few concrete, verifiable reasons stand out, and none of them are mysterious. First, generational distance from scandal. Leonor was born in 2005, which means she has no personal association whatsoever with the Juan Carlos era controversies that still define how a huge portion of the Spanish public thinks about the crown. She wasn't an adult during any of it. She couldn't have been involved even if she'd wanted to be. That's an asset that literally cannot be manufactured or accelerated. It only accrues with time, and every year that passes without a scandal attached to her name is a year that compounds in her favor. Second, and this connects directly to the military training story we covered in a previous video, verifiable, demonstrable competence. Her 3 years of military education across the Army, Navy, and Air and Space Force, culminating in July 2026, gave the public a steady stream of concrete, photographable milestones, a night parachute jump, time piloting an F-5 fighter jet, honors including the Grand Cross of Military Merit in July 2024 and the Grand Cross of Naval Merit in July 2025, all of it institutionally documented rather than simply asserted. Trust built on demonstrated competence tends to be stickier than trust built on inherited status alone, because it survives scrutiny in a way that pure lineage doesn't. Third, the specific political positioning she occupies. That January 2024 Sigma Dose data showing strong approval from both PSOE and Vox voters simultaneously isn't an accident of personality. It's a function of Zarzuela's broader strategy, keeping her public statements almost entirely apolitical, focused on constitutional duty, education, and service rather than anything that could be read as partisan. In a country as politically polarized as Spain currently is, that kind of studied neutrality is worth more in polling terms than almost anything else she could do. And fourth, timing. She came of age and stepped into public life at a moment when the institution desperately needed a fresh face disconnected from its worst chapter, and the palace, according to that Malay Mail reporting around her 18th birthday, appears to have understood that timing advantage and used it deliberately, keeping her relatively shielded during her school years so that her adult public debut would land with maximum goodwill rather than years of accumulated overexposure working against her. But none of that resolves the underlying tension this video opened with, and I don't want to pretend it does just to deliver a tidier ending. Leonor's personal approval numbers are genuinely strong, some of the strongest in the entire royal family's recent history. But she is, in a very real sense, running ahead of the institution she's set to inherit. The University of Murcia data from May 2026 makes clear that a slim majority of Spaniards currently favor a republic over the monarchy as a system of government, even while favoring Leonor as an individual within that system. Public confidence in an heir and public confidence in the crown as an institution are related, but they are not the same thing, and conflating them is exactly the kind of imprecision that gets a title like, "Why the Spanish People Finally Trust Leonor," written in the first place, when what's actually happening is more accurately described as, "Why Leonor personally polls better than the institution she's set to inherit." That gap matters enormously for what happens next. Because Leonor is now entering the next visible chapter of her public life, starting this September at Carlos III University in Getafe, pursuing a degree in political science, a 4-year program covering not just political theory but law, sociology, economics, and international relations, according to reporting on her enrollment. Every year of that degree, assuming it proceeds scandal-free and she continues threading the same politically neutral needle she's maintained so far, is another year of compounding goodwill, another set of data points the palace can point to when the next round of polling comes out. Whether that eventually closes the gap between her individual approval and the institution's overall standing is genuinely an open question, one that depends on things well beyond her control: the broader political climate in Spain, whether new controversies attach themselves to other family members, and whether the generational shift toward Republican sentiment among younger Spaniards that several of these surveys have flagged continues to grow or levels off. What we can say with confidence, based on everything the actual data shows rather than what a punchy headline implies, is this: Spain has not resolved its complicated relationship with its monarchy, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to a genuinely fascinating and unresolved story. What Spain has done is find, in Leonor specifically, someone who manages to poll well across an unusually wide political spectrum, someone whose youth and lack of scandal history give her a kind of clean slate her father and grandfather never had, and someone whose visible, verifiable effort, in the military academy, and now in a rigorous political science program, gives skeptical Spaniards something concrete to evaluate rather than simply inherited title to either accept or reject. That's not the same as, finally trusting, the monarchy. It's closer to a country reserving judgment on an institution while quietly extending real, measurable goodwill to the one person who might eventually justify keeping it. If you want the next chapter of this story as it develops, her first semester at Carlos III University, and whatever polling comes out once she's a visible, active political science student rather than a cadet, that's exactly the kind of update this channel exists to track accurately instead of speculatively. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you in the next one. This script is intended for internal production use only and is not for broadcast. Polling figures cited are sourced from Sociométrica El Español, Sigma dos Ola, and the University of Murcia's The Crown's academic research project as reported by Publico and Moncloa, spanning October 2023 through May 2026. Exact scores and percentages vary by pollster and survey wave and should be understood as directional rather than a single unified metric. The title's framing of "Finally Trust" was assessed as an overstatement relative to the underlying data and was deliberately reframed within the script itself, presented transparently as editorial judgment rather than an unverified claim, to distinguish personal approval of Leonor from institutional trust in the monarchy, which remains closely and recently split per the May 2026 Murcia study. No claims about future election outcomes, referendum timing, or the monarchy's ultimate survival have been included, as none are currently verifiable.